Welcome to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. I'm KM Weiland, and I am here to take you deep with story theory, writing techniques, and the incredible wisdom of story. I believe story is the greatest power on this earth, and that as writers, we carry the torch of wielding that power with responsibility, passion, and skill. There is no such thing as just a story. Today, it is my honor and my purpose to help you write your best story, astound the world, and maybe change your life. Hello, and welcome to this week's video. My name is KM Weiland, and I run the writing website Helping Writers Become Authors. And this week's question is from Grace Clay, who asks, I would like more advice about transitions, please. In particular, transitioning out of big set pieces. The best books, or at least my favorite books, tend to follow up their massive orchestral scenes with something a little more contemplative to let the audience catch their breaths. But how you make this transition is still beyond me. So as I was kind of thinking about what to call this video, one of my working title ideas was something big just happened in my story. Now what? And this is a really good question because I think we all come up with these really big scene ideas. They're very often the ones that inspire the story and that they're the ones we are looking forward to writing, and therefore we build our stories around them. And yet it can be kind of tricky to get into them and get out of them. So for starters, one of the main things to think about is just story structure. Are these scenes, properly being built into and properly being built out of within the entire structure, so they don't just feel like they're stuck in there because the author really, really liked the idea. And I've written a couple of these myself, so if you're doing this, I can totally commiserate. But more to the point, as far as the actual transition, the thing to think about here is scene structure, right? So scene structure is literally about this ebb and this flow between kind of the bigger, more dramatic moments and the softer, more contemplative ones that follow as they do in life. As something big happens and we have to rest and integrate and, think about what's happened before we can move on to the next thing. And that is what scene structure allows us to recreate in our stories. So classically, scene structure is often broken down into two halves, which are called scene and sequel, but are really just about action and reaction. So the scene half aligns with action and the sequel half with reaction. And we can also think of these as cause and consequence, right? It's the scenes where something happens and then the scene where the fallout happens and there has to be readjustment and the characters have to, think about it and figure out what went right and what went wrong and what are we going to do next as we continue to pursue our plot goal. And the beauty of this is that when you set these up properly, each one naturally just leads into the next. And you end up with this beautiful line of dominoes that I often talk about, how you want each scene to be a domino in a row of dominoes so that when you hit that first one, the whole thing just runs smoothly. And the transitions almost happen of their own accord, as far as, just moving the characters from one place to another or one mindset to another within the story. So I've talked in depth about scene structure often on my website and also in my book, Structuring Your Novel. So you can look there for more information on this, but just briefly so that you understand what I'm talking about when I talk about scene structure. Again, you can break scene down into two halves, scene and sequel, and the scene half, which is focused on action, is then further broken down into a focus on the character's goal, conflict that arises or opposition that arises to that goal, and then the outcome of whatever happens as that goal meets that opposition. And usually throughout most of the story until you get to the end, that outcome is going to have some sort of a disastrous flavor to it, in the sense that either the character doesn't get what they wanted in that scene or they get what they wanted, but there are unforeseen complications or consequences. Right? Because if they just can immediately get everything they want, bing, 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 then they get to the plot goal very quickly and the story is over. So it's this conflict and the complications that it creates that really is what creates plot and allows us to extend the character's problem over the course of an entire story. So after they reach the outcome of that scene part or that disaster, then from there they move into the reaction half, which is generally called sequel. And this is where the character reacts, where they, react to whatever just happened, whether it was big or small, and they kind of face the dilemma that has emerged because they didn't completely get what they wanted, right? Or even if they did, now they have to think about what they're going to do with it and what comes next. And from there, out of that dilemma will arise a decision about what they're going to do, which will lead directly into the next scene's goal. And so you can see how it's just this cycle where they just beautifully bump into each other. And you don't have to fully express or dramatize every single part of the scene's structure. It will depend, on how much emphasis you want to put on each part. Generally speaking, if you're at the moment, whatever's happening in your story, you're focusing more on fast pacing and drama and, the conflict. You're going to put more emphasis and more time into the action half of the scene. Whereas if you're wanting to slow it down, you're wanting it to be more character driven, you're really wanting to be more introspective and explore the inner conflict and the inner consequences of what's happened previously, then maybe you're going to want to extend that sequel half and focus more on the characters' reactions. And it just depends really on the pacing. But generally speaking, you can think just in terms of trying to balance these things. So when it comes to the big set piece scenes, like Grace is talking about, generally speaking, because these scenes are necessarily designed to create consequences, right? They're designed not just to create little, scene level consequences of, oh, I didn't quite get what I wanted. It's like big story level consequences of, whoa, this completely changed my life, basically, or completely changed my perspective of the nature of the conflict or, my relationship to the plot goal. That creates massive consequences and requires a lot of integration and some introspection from characters. So you will get generally the biggest bang for your buck by balancing these really big action scenes. And again, action could be like literal action as we think of like action movies with car chases and shootouts. But action is whatever is the primary drama within your story. So it could be relational. It could be, and in certain types of story, it could be your character, out there talking to the moon or something like that. So just identify whatever is the primary action within your story, where the plot is moving, where the character is making progress toward that plot goal, and then balance that with reaction, where the consequences are created in their relationship to how they're moving forward in the world. And now they have to kind of think about it and integrate what's happened and how that's going to change them and their perspectives. This is often a time where there is a lot of development within relationships between characters as they kind of integrate together, right? And they're thinking about, maybe there's apologizing, maybe there's recalibrating, maybe there's explaining, motivations and things that there weren't necessarily time for in previous scenes. So these quieter, more contemplative scenes are so important for maintaining the realism within a story, for proving how your characters have changed and why they've changed and kind of keeping readers up to date on that. And also just for creating a realism to how this evolves and plays out within a story so that it mirrors what we experience in real life. And it's also very important in affecting pacing. Without these contemplative sequel parts of the scene, you just end up with a madcap race 'em, chase 'em story that never quits. And that's, I'm not going to say that's fine because you always want some ebb and flow. But some stories are designed so where the emphasis is absolutely on the action part of the scene and they don't slow up too much. But very few stories can survive and be successful without some creation of this ebb and flow, without some balance of action and reaction, cause and consequence, right? Because truly, the most interesting thing about, the things that happen in a story, the causes, are the consequences. It's less about, the action and what the character does and more about the outcome that results from that and having to grapple with the complexity that often comes out of that. Sequel scenes are almost always my favorite to read or watch or write, I think. And that's not to say I don't love the action scenes, because I do. But there's just something really juicy about a good reaction scene, a good sequel scene. So it's definitely something that you want to figure out how to execute within your story. And paying attention to that ebb and flow and that balance of scene structure, of action and reaction, is the single best way to do that, because it literally allows the transitions to build themselves, right? You're just following the characters as they move through the story. They move through the action part where they have a goal, where there's consequences, and then they just immediately move into addressing those consequences and dealing with them and using them to then roll over into the next part of the action where they try to do something again, and the cycle kind of repeats itself. But it's like this upward spiral where they're learning, right? They're learning how to be more effective in their actions and how to refine their perspectives in the character arc. And that's what allows the story to evolve and repeat this pattern without feeling repetitive. It feels like it's evolving and deepening the story. Another thing to think about as you're designing particularly the big set piece scenes is to just keep in mind that very often these scenes are not a single scene, right? Because of their nature and how big they are and important they are within the story, they will often be comprised of mini scenes within a larger sequence that is designed to advance, whatever the structural beat is that you're focusing on, like say the midpoint, for example, in the middle of the story. And in this case, not only will you likely have kind of a mopping up period afterwards in which there is a designated sequel to this entire sequence in which characters react to the final outcome of whatever happens in that sequence, but a sequence is a series of scenes, right? So built within that, you also have, on a smaller level, action reaction. And that means that you can kind of space out the character's reaction. So there isn't necessarily this great big dump of explaining everything that they had to react to throughout that entire period. But you can sequence it so that there's, the smaller action within the larger sequence and a smaller reaction to that, as they build and evolve, their relationship to the overall goal for that sequence by playing out smaller scene goals within that, which is also something that does help it feel faster. The pacing feels faster because of that. Because if you have, let's just say, like 3 chapters or more that is just focused on one goal, and that's the entire thing, one goal, one obstacle they have to overcome, that can actually really slow your story down. The longer a section is, anything within a story, whether it's a sentence or a scene or a chapter or a sequence, the slower the pacing gets. But if you can divide that up into smaller, scene goals and followed with smaller reactions, that actually keeps the pacing really snappy. And if you're doing, an intense, section within your story, whatever type of action you're dealing with, that's usually something you want at the big plot points. It's something that, keeps readers turning those pages to find out what's happening because there's constant evolution. So you can take a great big plot goal, same as we do for the entire book, but a great big plot goal that's for that specific sequence, and then break it down into smaller goals that have to be accomplished to reach it, and divide those into scenes. And that allows you to then sew in those smaller contemplative moments as you go in a smaller way. It's not necessarily where everybody's screeching the action to a stop so they can have a conversation, but you're at least, going within the characters and allowing them to respond to consequences and so forth, so that you can help develop and keep readers apace with how the characters are thinking about this and why they're making the decisions they are as they go along. And it can also help make the action feel more spontaneous, right? Because if they have one plot goal and, it's this slow progression toward it and then they get it at the end, then that can seem very manufactured sometimes. Whereas if, they have a big plot goal, but then something happens and they have to divide it into smaller beats, and, a new plot goal, new opposition, and overcoming that as they go, it's a lot more like real life. Because usually, if you're like me, you have a master plan and it never works out that way, right? Like how you think it's going to happen isn't how it works out. And you have to react and respond to what's happening in real life. I think it was, I'm going to totally paraphrase this, but Dwight D. Eisenhower, who said something like, battle plans are great until you get into battle, right? And then you have to be able to adapt. And you want to recreate the sense of that for your characters in whatever they're doing, that they're not in control, right? They're not controlling the action, no matter how good they are at achieving their plot goals, because there's a very complex nature to the world of your story, and they have to be able to respond to that as they go. So just recognizing that can help you move through those transitions a little simpler in realizing like it isn't just big scene and then big contemplative scene, which it can be, but it's also broken down into smaller integers as you go. Okay, so let's just close out by talking a bit about the actual transition and how you might accomplish that. And the first thing I want to say is that it's important to realize that when we talk about scene breaks or chapter breaks, those have nothing to do with scene structure, right? You can certainly break at certain points within the scene structure, and that can be very helpful for creating transition. But you can create a scene break, a little divider on the page or a new chapter anywhere within scene structure. It does not affect the scene structure. So when I talk about a scene break, I'm not talking about the end of a structural scene or a structural sequel, okay? I'm just talking about the point on the page where the reader is told, you can stop here, and then you want to create a hook so that hopefully they'll pick the book back up again later on, right? Okay, so some ways that you can create smooth transitions are to pay attention to scene structure. Because scene structure does naturally create some really good hooks that can pull readers in, as well as some natural breaks that just make sense for, to stop for a bit before you move on to the next thing, because you're changing setting or you're changing a plot goal or something like that. One of my favorite places to break scenes is in between the scene and the sequel half. So after the action half is finished and before the reaction half. And that allows you to end with the scene's outcome/disaster, which often creates a very good hook because it foreshadows consequences, right? And that makes readers curious, like what's going to happen? How are the characters going to react to this? What's their response going to be? And that can pull them naturally into the next section and allows you to begin with that reaction phase and then build into another action sequence. So that can be a very effective way to transition your story and to use scene breaks to help you kind of emphasize your scene structure. Just generally, you want to end your scenes, you want to break your scene on some kind of a hook, something that makes readers curious about what's going to happen. And this doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be a jump scare or something where it's like, oh my gosh, I didn't see that coming, a plot twist or whatever, every single scene break. But just something, again, where they're just curious how the characters are going to respond. Something big has happened. And that's actually a really good place to end, because that means that there's going to be reactions and consequences to sort through. And it's very interesting. And really, that's what pulls reader forward, to find out how characters are going to react to things. But generally speaking, you just want to make sure there's some kind of a hook that leads into the next section. The best way to think of a hook, in my opinion, is just as a question. And it doesn't have to be an explicit, literal question, but it's something that gets readers wondering, right? It's like, it's a loose end. It's like, we don't know what's going to happen here. We don't know how the character is going to react. And that is often enough to pull readers in. And it often also promises a really good scene, and readers can imagine, oh, this confrontation is going to be juicy or whatever. And that too can be enough to pull them over into the next scene. I like to often think about, just on a more technical level, to create an elegant kind of transition, is to think about bridging techniques. And this is kind of where you choose something at the end of the previous scene break that can be mirrored in the beginning of the next. In film, we often see this in scene transitions where maybe there's, they focus on something that's a circle in one scene, and then the scene fades out and it's a circle in the next scene. And it's just like a visual cue that helps switch over. And obviously you can't do that in written fiction, but you can focus on imagery, on symbolism, just on things that are similar from one scene to the next. And you don't want to be too on the nose about this or draw too much attention to it. But when it's done right, it can just kind of allow you to ease readers through that transition. Something kind of fun that I did in my last work in progress that was just more fun than anything else. But I would challenge myself to, when I wrote the beginning of a new scene, I would challenge myself to put a word in the first line of that scene that was also in the last line of the previous scene. So obviously not words like the or stuff like that, but let's just say cathedral. That was a word at the end of the last sentence of the last scene. And then to try to find a way to pull that or any other word in the sentence forward into the next scene. And the idea was that it wouldn't necessarily be something readers would be conscious of, but that it would kind of create that segue between scenes. And again, mostly it was just kind of a fun thing. But that gives you an idea about bridging and how you can try to just create resonance between the closing of one scene and the beginning of the next, just with your language and with your words. Now, the most important thing to know about and to keep in mind when it comes to scene breaks and chapter breaks is you don't want to lie to readers, right? You want to pique their curiosity, you want to pull them into the next scene or chapter, but you want to do so honestly. Creating a situation where it seems like something terrible has happened or something really intriguing or exciting has happened. And it pulls readers on. They're like, oh, that's interesting. And they move into the next scene only to find out like it was a joke or something. Like, for instance, they think the bad guys are attacking the base, but it turns out it was just a practical joke from the hero's buddy or whatever. That's generally speaking not very effective. Not only is it annoying to readers, but it literally doesn't advance the plot. And unless it does. I mean, if there is a point to it, that's different. But if it's, something where you've just constructed this fake drama and tension to pull readers in and then, oops, yeah, just kidding, it really wasn't like that. Nah, don't do that. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. There's a lot to just transitions in general, which I didn't talk about today because I wanted to focus on specifically how do you work with the big scenes in comparison to the small scenes. So I will leave some more resources down below. And if you have any questions, you can always leave those in the comments. And I will consider your questions for future videos if you'd like to leave those. And if you'd like to stay in touch with my work and what I do and all of the resources that I put out, because I do a in-depth text post and podcast every week in addition to these videos, you can keep in touch with all of that by signing up for my mailing list. You can also keep in touch with me on Instagram at author KM Weiland. And I will see you in the next video. Until then, happy writing. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Helping Writers Become Authors. I hope you'll stop by the site for a full transcript of this episode and to join in the conversation in the comments. Tune in for next week's episode, where we'll continue to explore all things writing and storytelling. If you'd like to support the podcast, it always means a ton when you take a moment to leave a quick rating or review on Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, or Spotify. To stay updated on all the latest content I create for you, the best way is to join my mailing list at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com/mailing list. You'll also immediately gain access to lots of free resources, including my books, Crafting Unforgettable Characters and 5 Secrets of Story Structure. For real-time connection with me, more writing advice, and behind-the-scenes glimpses, follow me on Instagram at author KM Weiland. A heartfelt thank you to each one of you for your support and enthusiasm, and especially those of you who support my work on patreon.com/KM Weiland. You help make my site, this podcast, and so many other resources available to writers everywhere. So until next week, keep writing, keep dreaming, and most importantly, keep being true to your stories. Thank you for being part of helping writers become authors.